The Flying Milk Bottles. Part 1. How the P-47 Thunderbolt turned laughter into fear. Let's be honest. When we think of World War II fighter planes, we picture something sleek, graceful, and deadly. A sky shark, a predator built for speed and elegance. We imagine the Spitfire, with its lyrical curves, or the Messerschmitt Bf 109, a razor-sharp dart of malevolent intent. What we don't picture is a flying brick, a portly, pugnacious, and profoundly unsophisticated-looking machine that appears to have eaten a smaller, more aerodynamic plane and is now struggling to digest it. But in the brutal calculus of total war, beauty is as beauty does. And this is the story of how the ugliest, most ridiculed plane in the European theater punched beauty right in the mouth, grabbed a pint, and asked for another. This is the story of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the jug, the flying milk bottle that became the sound of German dread in the high, thin air where death now lived. Act 1, April 8th, 1943. The Laugh in the Sky. 27,000 feet above the quaint Norman town of Caen, France. Let's pause here for a second. 27,000 feet. That's over 5 miles straight up. At this altitude, the air is so thin it feels like you're trying to breathe through a straw someone left in the freezer. The temperature sits at a balmy -40 degrees Fahrenheit, which in a fun twist of physics is also -40 degrees Celsius. See, war can be educational. The sun isn't warm, it's just a brilliant, cold white hole in the deep purple sky, a coin frozen in the celestial vault. On this particular April morning, the sky over Caen is a canvas for a deadly art exhibit. Delicate white contrails, the frozen breath of aircraft, curve and braid through the stratosphere. They're beautiful, ephemeral, and mark the paths of young men trying to kill each other. They fade almost as fast as they're drawn, ghostly signatures on a vast blue page. In the snug cockpit of a Focke-Wulf 190A5, one of the most formidable fighter aircraft ever built, Oberlieutenant Ralph Hermaken adjusts his oxygen mask. The Focke-Wulf, or the Butcher Bird, is a masterpiece of German engineering. Compact, brutally powerful, heavily armed, and as nimble as a fencer. Hermaken is an experienced pilot, a predator in his natural element. He scans the horizon, and then he sees them. Climbing laboriously out of the haze below are 12.5 aircraft. But they're wrong. They're not sleek. They're squat, bulbous, and gleam with a dull silver finish. They looked less like birds of prey and more like overgrown metal tadpoles, or, as one historian would later put it, a pregnant guppy with a glandular condition. They were climbing with the determined, plodding grace of a freight elevator. A grin spreads beneath Hermaken's mask. He keys his radio, his voice crackling with static and undisguised amusement to the other pilots in his Schwarm. Die Amerikaner haben uns fliegende Milchbottle geschickt. The Americans have sent us flying milk bottles. The radio ether erupts in crackling German laughter. From their high perch, the Luftwaffe pilots circle like hawks, eyeing a flock of particularly clumsy pigeons. The contrast is almost comical. Their own machines, the agile FW-190s and the elegant BF-109s, are the result of years of combat-honed design. These things looked like someone bolted wings to a boiler tank. They were fresh, they were American, and they were a joke. But what Hermaken and his comrades couldn't know, what their laughter couldn't possibly encompass, was that they were witnessing the birth of a legend they would soon curse. Those flying milk bottles were Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, and they were about to tear up the Luftwaffe's playbook, set it on fire, and stomp on the ashes. Within 18 months, the condescending laughter on that radio would be replaced by a static-filled silence, and the name Thunderbolt would become a one-word prayer for survival in the high, thin air where death now lived. Act 2, 1940. The monster is born. 3 years earlier, and an ocean away, the war in Europe was a distant, ominous thunder. For most Americans, it was something read about in the bold headlines of the Chicago Tribune or seen in grainy newsreels at the local cinema. But for the United States Air Corps, the USAAC, the writing wasn't just on the wall, it was screaming in neon. The fall of France was a brutal lesson. The era of biplanes and gentlemanly duels was over. The Luftwaffe was a battle-hardened, terrifyingly effective force. The USAAC needed a new interceptor, something that could fly higher, dive faster, and hit harder than anything in the sky. They needed a super fighter. The request for this miracle machine landed on the drafting table of a man named Alexander Kartveli. Born in Tbilisi, Georgia, the one near the Black Sea, not the one known for peaches, Kartveli was a brilliant, driven, and perpetually chain-smoking engineer who had fled the Bolshevik Revolution and rebuilt his life in New York. As the chief designer for Republic Aviation, he was known for his unorthodox ideas and a stubborn belief in raw power. He looked at the USAAC's specifications for a high-altitude interceptor, a request for something fast and deadly, and he saw its limitations. The story goes that he tapped the paper with his pencil, a cloud of smoke wreathing his head, and muttered to his team, "They want a falcon, but what they need is a bowl." And so, in a Long Island hangar thick with coffee, cigarettes, and drafting ink, the bowl was conceived. Kartveli and his team threw out the conventional wisdom. Instead of a slender, liquid-cooled engine like the Rolls-Royce Merlin that powered the Spitfire and Mustang, they went big, really big. They chose the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an absolute beast of a power plant. Let's talk about this engine for a second because it deserves the spotlight. It was an 18-cylinder radial engine with a displacement of 2,800 cubic inches, or 46 liters. To put that in perspective, the engine in your family car is probably around 2 to 3 liters. This thing produced 2,000 horsepower, and its roar was less a sound and more a physical disturbance in the air. But a big engine at sea level is one thing. At 30,000 feet, where the air is thin, it would wheeze and die. The secret sauce, Kartveli's masterstroke, was the turbo supercharger. This wasn't just a simple supercharger, it was a complex, Rube Goldberg-esque system of ducts and pipes that ran from the engine, down the fuselage, through a turbine in the tail, and back again. It took the thin, anemic air of the stratosphere, compressed it, and force-fed it into the engine, allowing the Double Wasp to bellow with full-throated fury where other engines gasped for breath. When the blueprints were finished, one of the junior engineers, bleary-eyed from an all-nighter, reportedly blinked at the plans and said, "Sir, it looks pregnant." Kartveli, ever the pragmatist, is said to have smiled. "It will be a dinosaur, but a dinosaur with good proportions." In May 1941, the prototype, designated the XP-47B, was rolled onto the Republic airfield. The reaction from seasoned pilots and mechanics was a unified, stunned silence. The thing was enormous. It weighed nearly 7 tons empty. Its wingspan was over 40 feet, and it stood 14 feet tall. It was, by a significant margin, the largest, heaviest, single-engined fighter anyone had ever seen. Mechanics joked that it would need a runway that started in New York and ended in Boston just to get its wheels up. Then, they started the engine. The ground shook. Windows and hangars a mile away rattled in their frames. The massive, 4-bladed propeller became a shimmering, circular disc of menace. The monster began to move, gathering speed with a ponderous, terrifying inevitability. It lumbered into the air, not leaping skyward like a Spitfire, but insisting its way upward, defying gravity through sheer force of will. It climbed, and it climbed. and it kept climbing. At 27,000 feet, the test pilot, Lowery Bryan, radioed down, his voice crackling with disbelief and excitement. "She's still got power." No one back on the ground quite believed it, but the Pratt & Whitney, fed by its labyrinthine supercharger, was breathing the stratosphere like it was a spring meadow. Alexander Kartvel's dinosaur was not only alive, it was king of the mountain.
Act 17. The factory that never slept. Behind every victory, every safe return, every German tank destroyed, stood a miracle of production. The Thunderbolt was not just a masterpiece of design, it was a triumph of American industry. At Republic Aviation's main plant in Farmingdale, Long Island, the lights never went out. The factory operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with men and women working in 3 relentless shifts. At its peak, this single facility was producing one new, fully complex P-47 Thunderbolt every single hour. The demand was so great that a second massive plant was built from scratch in Evansville, Indiana. By 1944, this inland factory was churning out an additional 500 aircraft every month. Each jug was a complex beast, containing 65,000 individual parts, 8 miles of electrical wiring, and 2,400 precision machine components. The scale was mind-boggling. And the juggernaut didn't stop with the planes. Each combat sortie required 3,400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition for its 8 guns. By mid-1944, American factories were producing over 30 million rounds of .50 caliber ammunition every month. The fuel to feed this thirsty fleet was another river of plenty. The 9th Air Force alone was burning through 25 million gallons of high-octane avgas per month. This industrial advantage translated directly into a tactical one. An American pilot entered combat with over 400 hours of training in his logbook. His German counterpart in 1945 was a novice, lucky to have 100 hours, and sometimes rushed to the front with only 30. The result was a force of not just better equipped pilots, but better trained, more confident, and more disciplined ones. They weren't just flying a better plane, they were better pilots flying a better plane. Act 18. The Fall of the Luftwaffe. By the spring of 1945, the Luftwaffe was a phantom. Its airfields were lunar landscapes of bomb craters. Its fuel reserves were a bitter memory. The few remaining operational fighters were hidden in woods or camouflaged near autobahns, and they were flown by boys who had more enthusiasm than experience. Those few who dared to take off found themselves flying into a meat grinder perfected over 2 years of war. A swarm of 4 German fighters would be bounced by a full squadron of 16 Thunderbolts. The American pilots, flying in perfect fluid formations, would execute the Zemke fan, or simply boom and zoom with cold mechanical efficiency. The first burst of .50 caliber fire would tear a wing off. The second would erase the cockpit. On the ground, German soldiers suffered from what their doctors diagnosed as Jabo fever. It was a psychological breaking point. Men would tremble, vomit, or simply freeze catatonic at the first distant rumble of an approaching fighter bomber. It was a sickness with no cure, because the only prescription was the absence of Thunderbolts, and that was not an available treatment in 1945. The ultimate admission of defeat came from the very men who had once mocked it. Captured Luftwaffe ace Josef Pips Priller, who had famously led only 2 planes over the D-Day beaches, summed it up with bitter respect in a post-war interrogation. The Thunderbolt is the best fighter bomber ever built. It never jams, never overheats, never quits. It carries bombs like a bomber, rockets like artillery, and still fights like a first-rate fighter. We laughed at them in 1943. We're not laughing now. By May 1945, there was no one left in Germany to laugh at all. Act 19.
the thunder rolls into history. When the guns finally fell silent in both Europe and the Pacific, the numbers told a story of almost unimaginable achievement. More than 15,600 Thunderbolts had been built, more than any other U.S. fighter in history. Their combined combat record was staggering. Enemy aircraft destroyed, over 7,000 in air-to-air combat. Ground targets destroyed, 9,000 locomotives, 68,000 trucks, 6,000 armored vehicles, and 86,000 rail cars. Sorties flown, over 546,000 combat missions in Europe alone. Today, at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, a single pristine P-47D hangs from the ceiling, its silver skin gleaming under the lights. On its placard are the cold, hard numbers: speed, range, weight, armament. But next to it, in a small glass case, lies the soul of the beast. A strip of gun camera film, frozen frames showing a Focke-Wulf 190 bursting apart under a hail of .50 caliber fire. Beside it is a handful of spent shell casings, each one once part of that storm. Beneath the display, a quote from an unnamed captured German pilot is etched into a plaque. It serves as the perfect epitaph for the flying milk bottle. We laughed when we first saw them. Fat, ugly machines that couldn't turn, couldn't climb, couldn't fight. We stopped laughing when they pointed their guns at us. Then we stopped existing. The P-47 Thunderbolt entered the war as a joke and ended it as an indelible legend. It began its life mocked as a flying milk bottle and finished it revered as the Jug, the plane that could do anything, take anything, and kill anything. It was the brute force solution to the complex problem of war, and its story is forever woven into the sound of victory, a deep, rolling, and eternal thunder. Thanks for watching. This is the Frontline Frontier. Subscribe for more.
Act 3, 1942, The Beast That Bites Back. In 1942, the first production P-47s arrived in England, delivered to the 56th Fighter Group, commanded by a tough, no-nonsense major named Hubert "Hub" Zemke. The pilots of the 56th, many of whom had trained on nimble aircraft like the P-40 Warhawk, gathered around their new mounts with a sense of eager anticipation. That anticipation quickly curdled into pure, unadulterated terror. Their first impressions were brutally honest. "It was the biggest single-engine airplane I had ever seen," one pilot recalled. "I walked around it 3 times and I still wasn't sure it would fly." The P-47 was a handful. On the ground, its massive nose blocked the pilot's view so completely that taxiing required a serpentine S pattern just to see where you were going. Taking off was an act of faith and brute strength. The tremendous torque from the engine wanted to roll the plane onto its back, and the pilot had to wrestle with the controls to keep it straight. Landing was worse. The Jug had a notoriously narrow landing gear, and if you touched down with the slightest crosswind or uneven pressure, it would initiate a ground loop. A violent, spinning cartwheel that would shred the landing gear, snap the propeller, and turn several $100,000 of American engineering into a pile of scrap metal. The pilots developed a new vocabulary of curses specifically for the occasion. Then there was the dive. In combat, diving away from an enemy is a fundamental survival tactic. But the early Thunderbolts had a sinister secret. When they dove at high speed, approaching 500 miles per hour, they would encounter a phenomenon known as compressibility. In simple terms, the air flowing over the wings would become so compressed, it would effectively lock the controls. The ailerons wouldn't respond, the elevator would freeze, and the plane would become a 7-ton bullet in an uncontrollable plunge towards the earth. More than one brave pilot learned about compressibility the hard way, vanishing into the English Channel or the French countryside. The losses were staggering. Between September 1942 and January 1943, the 56th Fighter Group lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft, not to German guns, but to accidents, ground loops, and mysterious dives. Morale plummeted. Hub Zemke, a man not known for his gentle demeanor, was furious. He reportedly stormed into a briefing and growled, "If the Germans don't kill us, this damned airplane will." But slowly, painfully, a strange thing began to happen. The pilots who survived the Jug's vicious quirks started to understand it. They realized it wasn't a delicate sports car. It was a heavyweight boxer. You didn't finesse it, you wrestled it. You didn't dance with the enemy, you bludgeoned him. One of these survivors was a quiet, determined farm boy from Lawton, Oklahoma, named Robert S. Johnson. After his first full-power climb, where the Thunderbolt muscled its way to an altitude that left other fighters far below, he stumbled out of the cockpit, his ears ringing, and made an observation that would become legendary among Jug pilots. You don't fly the Jug, you aim it. And once you aimed it, it hit with the force of a freight train loaded with anvils. Act 4, Spring 1943, The Laughter Grows. The Thunderbolt's combat debut in the spring of 1943 did little to silence its critics. In fact, it gave them more ammunition. 16 P-47Cs from the 4th Fighter Group, flying as bomber escort over occupied France, were pounced upon by experienced Luftwaffe pilots. The results were brutal. The Jugs, hampered by a lack of external fuel tanks that limited their range to barely inside the French coast, were slow to react and clumsy in a turning fight. In 1 month, 14 Thunderbolts were shot down for only 3 confirmed kills. The German aces were merciless in their mockery. The nickname Jabo for Jog Bomber or Fighter Bomber was replaced by Jabo Sarg, the Fighter Bomber coffin. They joked that the Americans, with their industrial might, had simply welded wings to spare water heaters. Too fat to fight, too slow to climb became the common wisdom. Even their British allies, flying their beloved Spitfires, couldn't resist a bit of good-natured ribbing. One RAF pilot, after inspecting a P-47 on the tarmac, is famously said to have quipped, "I say, chaps, how do you get in? Do you just open a hatch and fill it with pilots?" Another remarked, "The best evasive maneuver in a Jug is to unstrap and run around the cockpit." But beneath the laughter, a different story was being written on the battered aluminum skins of the returning Thunderbolts. The planes that limped back to England, streaming smoke and trailing hydraulic fluid, were often so full of holes they looked like flying colanders. One returned with 21 gaping holes from 20mm cannon shells and over 100 smaller punctures from machine gun fire. The ground crew started counting the holes and gave up. By all rights, the plane should have disintegrated. It didn't. The secret was in Kartvelli's brutalist design philosophy. The air-cooled radial engine was a tank. A liquid-cooled engine, like the Merlin, had vulnerable radiator cores and coolant lines. A single bullet could cause it to seize or bleed out in minutes. The Double Wasp, however, was a massive lump of solid metal. It could swallow cannon shells, and while it might run rough, it would often keep going. The pilot was protected by a bulletproof windshield and a thick armor plate behind his seat. The control cables were redundant. Where a Spitfire was a precision instrument, the Jug was a blunt instrument. It could take a beating that would vaporize any other fighter. And when it stopped running and started fighting, the source of the German pilots' laughter suddenly became the source of their nightmares. The P-47 was armed with 8 .50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns. This wasn't a rifle, it was a broadside. Each gun fired at a rate of about 800 rounds per minute. Do the math, that's over 6,400 rounds per minute spewing forth from its wings. The guns were carefully harmonized so that all their bullets would converge into a single 6-foot wide sphere of molten lead at about 300 yards. A 2-second burst from a P-47 delivered over 200 rounds into that killing zone. For German pilots used to the elegant, high-velocity but slower-firing cannons of their own aircraft, this was a shocking, unnerving experience. This wasn't a duel, it was an execution. You weren't shot down, you were erased. The laughter was about to catch in their throats.
Act 5, June 26, 1943. The Miracle at WWII. Every legend needs a founding myth, a moment so improbable it defies belief. For the P-47, that moment came on June 26, 1943, over the French coast near WWII. A formation of 48 Thunderbolts from the 61st Fighter Squadron was heading home after a bomber escort mission. They were low on fuel and ammunition, their guard perhaps slightly down. It was the perfect moment for an ambush, and 16 Focke-Wulf 190s diving out of the sun took full advantage. Flying at the rear of the formation was our old friend, Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson. He never saw them coming. The first he knew of the attack was the sound of his own aircraft being torn to pieces. Wham! 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 20mm cannon shells ripped through the fuselage like it was tissue paper. His canopy exploded, showering him with plexiglass shards. Fire erupted from the engine, licking back over the wings. Hydraulic fluid, thick and smoky, geysered into the cockpit. Shrapnel tore into his right leg and nose. His plane, Half-Pint, was instantly transformed into a flying inferno. He was going down. His training kicked in. Bail out. He tried to jettison the shattered canopy. Nothing happened. He tried again, desperation rising. A cannon shell had fused the canopy rails shut. He was trapped in a coffin, 27,000 feet above the English Channel, and the coffin was on fire. Terrified, he muttered a prayer. "Lord, I ain't scared to die, but I don't want to die burning up," and pointed the nose toward England, hoping to at least get closer to home before the end. The crippled jug shuddered violently, threatening to tear itself apart. Smoke and fumes filled the cockpit. He was flying half blind, half conscious, and then the final nail in the coffin arrived. The same Focke-Wulf that had crippled him swooped back in for the kill. The German pilot, likely astonished this wreck was still flying, lined up for another pass. What followed was one of the most one-sided duels in aviation history. The German opened fire again. 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns hammered the already shattered Thunderbolt. Tracers streaked past Johnson's head. He hunched down behind the armored plate, feeling the impact shudder through the airframe. When the cannons ran out of ammunition, the German switched to his machine guns, peppering the jug until their barrels glowed cherry red. He made pass after pass, a hunter determined to finish his prey. Finally, out of ammunition and presumably out of ideas, the German pilot did something extraordinary. He pulled his Focke-Wulf alongside the mangled P-47. Johnson, bleeding and covered in oil, turned his head. Through the cracked and oil-smeared remains of his canopy, he locked eyes with the enemy pilot. He saw a young, blond man, his face a mask of sheer incredulity. The German stared at the flying wreck, shook his head in a gesture of what could only be awe and resignation, raised a gloved hand in a slow, deliberate salute, and then banked away, disappearing into the clouds. Alone again, he kept flying. The jug, by some miracle of engineering and sheer stubbornness, held together. He managed to nurse it across the channel, and with a dead engine and no hydraulics, he crash-landed at the emergency field at RAF Manston. He scrambled out, collapsing onto the blessed, solid earth. When the ground crew approached the wreck, they were speechless. They started counting the damage and stopped. The plane had over 200 bullet and shell holes. 3 of the 4 main structural loggerons in the fuselage were completely severed. The engine cowling was gone, control cables were shredded, the propeller was bent from the crash landing. It was, by every known law of physics and aeronautics, an impossibility. The story spread through the Allied air forces like wildfire. Disbelief turned to awe. Engineers from Republic Aviation came to examine the wreck and realized they had, if anything, underestimated the toughness of their creation. German intelligence, when they heard the reports, dismissed them as crude American propaganda. No aircraft could survive that. The American pilots just smiled. Ours can. Act 6. Summer 1943. The Thunderbolt Doctrine. Hub Zemke was a fighter pilot's fighter pilot, and he was also a brilliant tactician. He looked at the P-47 with its weaknesses, poor turn radius, slow climb, and its overwhelming strengths, devastating dive speed, massive firepower, and incredible survivability, and threw the standard dogfighting manual out the window. He gathered his pilots in a briefing hut in England, chalk in hand, and drew on the blackboard. "Listen up," Zemke began, his voice cutting through the fog of cigarette smoke. "Forget everything you think you know about air combat. We don't turn with them. We can't. If you try to dogfight a Focke-Wulf, you're a dead man." He drew 2 arrows on the board. One pointed steeply downward, the other pointed steeply upward. "This," he said, tapping the first arrow, "is your attack. We call it the boom." He tapped the second arrow, "And this is how you get out. We call it the zoom." The tactic was brutally simple, and it would become the Thunderbolt's mantra: boom and zoom. The doctrine was this: use your superior turbo-supercharged engine to climb high above 30,000 feet where the German fighters are sluggish. Patrol there using the sun to your advantage. When you spot the enemy below, you roll your jug inverted so you can keep sight of them, push the stick forward, and dive. The Thunderbolt in a dive was the fastest thing in the sky, easily hitting 550 miles per hour. You would plummet onto your unsuspecting target like a feathered anvil, unleash a 1 or 2 second burst from your 850 cals, and then, critically, you would keep going. You didn't pull up into a climb in front of them, you used your incredible speed to climb back up to altitude, safely out of reach, resetting for another killing pass. It was the aerial equivalent of a drive-by shooting. It was impersonal, devastating, and highly effective. Lieutenant Walker Bud Mahoran, another rising ace in the 56th, described it with a characteristic grin. He said, "You don't fight him, you swat him. You come down, wham, and if he's still there, that's his problem, not yours." The pilots began calling these one-sided engagements the Thunderbolt turkey shoot. For the first time, the Americans had a machine and a strategy that perfectly complemented each other. It played to their strengths: industrial mass, overwhelming firepower, and a belief that the best defense was an unstoppable offense. The laughter on the German radio channels began to be replaced by terse, worried calls of Achtung Jabos and the even more telling Dicke Autos, fat cars. The fat ones were here, and they were hungry.
Act 7, August 17th, 1943. Hammers from Heaven. The true test of any fighter is its ability to protect the bombers. On August 17, 1943, the Thunderbolt was called to its greatest challenge yet: Operation Starkey, the deep penetration raids on the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the aircraft plants at Regensburg. It was a maximum effort mission, and the Luftwaffe threw everything it had at the bomber streams. Major David Schilling, a charismatic and aggressive leader of the 62nd Fighter Squadron, led his Thunderbolts high above the B-17 flying fortresses. Below him, the sky was a hellish panorama he would later describe as black with flak and brown with airplanes. The German defenders rose to meet them, including squadrons of twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf-110 Zerstörrer destroyer heavy fighters. These were not nimble dogfighters. They were flying gun platforms, bristling with cannons and rockets designed to smash bombers out of the sky from outside the range of their defensive guns. Schilling's voice crackled over the radio, cool and clear. Let's introduce them to American firepower. The P-47s, holding the altitude advantage, rolled into their signature diving attacks. From 28,000 feet, they fell upon the Bf-110s like avenging angels. The air screamed around their wings. In one of the German destroyers, a gunner named Heinrich Roth saw a Thunderbolt diving on his formation. He fired early, his cannon shell streaking toward the American fighter. He was certain he had scored hits. But the P-47 didn't even shudder. It kept coming, growing larger in his sights. Then it fired back. Roth survived the encounter and later gave a chilling account. He said, "The aircraft ahead of us did not fall. It disappeared. Wings tail, everything was gone in 2 seconds. There was just a cloud of pieces. The 8 50 caliber machine guns had done their work. The concentrated firepower was so intense it could literally saw a bomber or a heavy fighter in half. In less than a minute, 8 Messerschmitt 110s were blown from the sky. The Germans, who had expected to slaughter the bombers, found themselves on the receiving end of a slaughter. The Germans called it a massacre. The American pilots, now battle-hardened and confident, called it Tuesday. From that day forward, no one in the Luftwaffe laughed at the Jug. Respect had been earned in the only currency that mattered in the skies over Europe. Act 8. Autumn 1943, the high-altitude Reaper. By the autumn of 1943, the Thunderbolt had established absolute dominance in the stratosphere. At 30,000 feet and above, the playing field was irrevocably tilted in its favor. The thin, frigid air that caused German engines to sputter and lose power was the Thunderbolt's natural habitat. The Pratt & Whitney, force-fed by its turbo-supercharger, thundered on with undiminished fury. The Luftwaffe pilots felt the change acutely. Their nimble fighters felt slow and unresponsive, while the Americans seemed to possess limitless energy. The ultimate testament to this shift came on October 8, 1943. The target was Bremen. Leading the German defenders was one of the Luftwaffe's living legends, Major Hans Philipp, a holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, an ace with an astounding 206 victories. He was a master, a hero of the Eastern Front, a man who embodied the skill and spirit of the German fighter arm. He led his squadron of Focke-Wulfs in a climb to intercept a formation of B-17s. They never made it. The sky above them seemed darkened as 30 Thunderbolts of the 52nd Fighter Squadron tipped over into their dive. In the cockpit of one of those jugs was Robert S. Johnson, the same man who had miraculously survived the flight of the Half-Pint just a few months earlier. He had learned his lessons well. He spotted a Focke-Wulf with distinctive yellow nose art, Philipp's plane. He didn't try to turn with it. He used his altitude and energy, swooping down in a high-speed pass. At 200 yards, he pressed the trigger. The 8 Brownings roared, their tracers walking up the fuselage of the German Aces fighter. The Focke-Wulf instantly blossomed into an orange fireball and disintegrated. There was no parachute. The death of a legend like Hans Philipp sent shockwaves through the Luftwaffe. If a pilot of his caliber could be so decisively killed by a flying milk bottle, what chance did the average pilot have? The reports that landed on Reichsmarschall Göring's desk made for grim reading. The technical assessments were terrifying. Service ceiling, 42,000 feet, far beyond the practical ceiling of German fighters. Dive speed, capable of approaching Mach 1, making it impossible to follow. Armor, a veritable flying fortress with heavy plate protecting the pilot from nearly every angle. Survivability, estimated at 3 times that of any other Allied or Axis fighter. The Luftwaffe's own assessment was final. The P-47 was no longer a curiosity or a clumsy foe. It was an extinction event. German soldiers on the ground, hearing the distinctive low-pitched, rolling thunder of the Jug's engine, a sound caused by the sheer volume of the exhaust, gave it a new, fearful name: Donnerschlag, the thunderclap. When they heard that sound, they knew that hammers from heaven were on their way. The Thunderbolt had become the sound of doom.
Act 9, January 1944. The Fat One learns to climb. Just when the Germans thought they had the measure of their foe, the Americans upgraded their champion. The new year of 1944 brought the P-47 D-22 model, and with it, a game-changing modification: a massive 13-foot diameter paddle blade propeller. The old propeller was like trying to stir the air with spoons. This new one was like using shovels.
It bit into the thin air with dramatically improved efficiency. The climb rate, once the Jug's Achilles heel, jumped from a sluggish 2,200 feet per minute to a very respectable 3,000 feet per minute. It could now get to the fight faster and regain altitude more quickly after an attack. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe was profound. They could no longer count on their altitude advantage. The diary entry of German ace Heinz Knoke speaks volumes. "The fat Americans have learned to climb. We bounced them near Hanover, expecting the usual advantage. They turned into us and followed us upward to 30,000 feet. Schmidt was caught and blown apart. These are not the same machines we laughed at last year." Even the Jug's acoustic signature changed. The new propeller tips, spinning at high speed, could break the sound barrier, creating a low, ripping, rolling thunder that could be heard from miles before the planes were even visible. For Allied troops on the ground, it was the sound of impending victory. For the Germans, it was the sound of terror. The nickname Jug, short for Juggernaut, had never been more fitting. By the spring of 1944, the transformation was complete. The hunters had become the hunted. The Luftwaffe's aces were being systematically killed, and their replacement pilots were green and terrified. The air superiority that would be so crucial for the D-Day landings in June was being won, mile by bloody mile, by the plane that nobody wanted. The Americans, the same men who had been mocked for their flying milk bottles, now ruled the sky from the English Channel to the borders of Germany. They had taken a laughingstock, and through courage, ingenuity, and an unshakable belief in their ungainly mount, forged it into the most feared and respected fighter of the European war. And this was only part one. The story of the Jug was about to get even bigger, dirtier, and more brutal, as it traded its high-altitude crown for a new role, the tank-busting, ground-pounding, earth-shaking brawler of the Normandy hedgerows. But that, as they say, is a story for another day. Act 10, April 1944, From Escort to Eraser. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe was a ghost of its former self. Its experienced pilots were dead, its fuel was scarce, and its airfields were under constant threat. The high-altitude duel between fighters was winding down, but the Thunderbolt wasn't about to be put out to pasture. It had simply found new things to hit. The P-47 was uniquely suited for this new, dirtier role. It was tough, it could carry a ludicrous amount of weight, and if it got shot up by ground fire, it had a better chance of coming home than any other plane. The new P-47 D-25 bubble-top variant, which replaced the old Razorback canopy with a beautiful all-round vision bubble, wasn't just a better fighter, it was a flying bomb truck. It could carry two 1,000-pound bombs under its wings, each the size of a small refrigerator, and another 500-pounder under its belly. That's a total of 2,500 pounds of high-explosive fury. For perspective, that was nearly the bomb load of a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress from the early days of the war. When those bombs were gone, the pilot still had his 8 decimal 5 caliber Brownings, each with 425 rounds, to strafe anything that hadn't already been vaporized. The transition from pristine dogfights at 30,000 feet to mud-spattered treetop attacks was a psychological shift for the pilots. Captain Charles Mac McVitie of the 405th Fighter Group wrote in a letter home, "It's a different kind of fear up high. It's clean, almost mathematical. Down here, it's personal. You see the whites of their eyes, as the saying goes. You see the driver of a truck leap from his cab. You smell the smoke and the cordite. You come home with leaves and branches in your landing gear." Along the roads of northern France, German convoys became mobile tombs. They crept only at dawn and dusk, praying for the cover of poor light. But the Jugs found them anyway. Hans von Luck of the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment later recalled a devastating attack with chilling clarity. "They came in so low, I could see the pilots' goggles glinting. The sound was like the end of the world. First, the deep rolling thunder of their engines, then the scream of their rockets,
And finally, the relentless jackhammering of their guns. It was not an attack, it was an erasure. In one single pass, 20 trucks and their precious cargoes simply ceased to exist. What was left was scrap metal and ash.
The Germans had a word for them: Jabos, a contraction of Jagdbomber, or fighter bomber. But that term felt inadequate. These weren't just attackers, they were flying artillery batteries, guided by young men in leather jackets who had mastered the art of delivering hell from above. Act 11, June 6, 1944. The Thunder over Normandy. The greatest amphibious invasion in history needed the greatest air cover in history, and it got it. At dawn on D-Day, as thousands of ships churned towards the French coast, the sky above them was a solid, humming canopy of American air power. And at the heart of that canopy were more than 500 Thunderbolts. It was a symphony of destruction, conducted at every altitude. At wave-top height, jugs streaked inland, strafing German reinforcement columns and command posts before they could even get organized. A little higher up, other flights patrolled the beachheads, their pilots watching for any sign of German armor moving towards the vulnerable landing zones. And high above it all, the top-cover jugs circled, their pilots bored but vigilant, waiting for a Luftwaffe that, for the most part, never came. The very air over Normandy seemed to tremble with the low, pervasive thunder of 1,000 Pratt & Whitney engines. The Luftwaffe's response was pitiful. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer, one of a handful of German pilots who managed to get airborne that day, later confessed in an interrogation, quote, "The sky belonged to the Americans. It was a wall of them. We tried at dawn. 12 of us took off from a field near Rams. I was the only one to return. You couldn't climb over them, you couldn't dive under them. They were everywhere. Their guns, they didn't shoot you down, they turned you into aluminum rain." End quote. The P-47s didn't just target troops, they systematically dismantled the German ability to wage war in the region. They used their bombs to cut railway lines, collapse bridges, and obliterate artillery emplacements placed in hedgerows. Even the mighty German tanks, the Panthers and Tigers that Allied infantrymen feared, were vulnerable. A 500-pound bomb landing nearby could blow off the tracks, or a well-placed rocket could punch through the thinner top armor. A tank immobilized by a jug was a tank soon destroyed by a Sherman or a Typhoon. When the Allied soldiers stormed out of their landing craft onto the bloody sands of Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the Thunderbolts were their shield, their sword, and their guardian angels. The statistics from that period are staggering. By the end of June, the 9th Air Force's Thunderbolts alone had destroyed or damaged 651 locomotives, 3,800 trucks, 500 armored vehicles, and over 4,000 horse-drawn wagons, a reminder that the German army still relied heavily on equestrian transport. The German army in France was being strangled. They could only move at night, crawling through the shadows like hunted animals, constantly listening for the sound that meant their time was up. Act 12, Summer 1944, the War on the Ground. The advance through France in the summer of 1944 was a brutal, grinding affair. The Bocage country, a labyrinth of small fields surrounded by thick, ancient hedgerows, was a defender's paradise. Every hedge concealed a German machine gun nest or an anti-tank gun. Progress was measured in yards and paid for in blood. In this close quarters nightmare, the P-47 became the artillery that could see. With plenty of forward airfields now in Allied hands, the jugs could loiter over the battlefield for hours, acting as omniscient, omnipotent angels of death for the ground troops. Pilots and ground controllers developed a new, efficient language for destruction. Rhubarbs, low-level strafing runs against targets of opportunity, a truck convoy, a staff car, a group of soldiers caught in the open. Rangers, armed reconnaissance missions, flying deep behind enemy lines to hunt for anything moving. Rail cuts, dedicated missions to dismantle the French rail network using 500-pound bombs with delayed fuses to tear up the tracks. Captain Walt Beckham of the 404th Fighter Group, who would become one of the top Thunderbolt aces, described the visceral, addictive power of the ground attack role. Quote, "You'd fly over a German column tucked into a narrow lane between hedgerows. You'd roll in, drop your 2 bombs, and pull up. As you circled back, you'd hose the area down with your 8 guns. When the smoke cleared, you'd look down and there was just nothing. A smear on the landscape. That's a hell of a feeling, terrifying and addictive at all at once. You've just erased a piece of the enemy's army." End quote. The Germans developed a profound physiological dread of the Thunderbolt. Its distinctive acoustic signature, a low-ripping, rolling thunder caused by the massive paddle blade propeller tips breaking the sound barrier, became the soundtrack of their despair. That sound would echo across quiet Norman villages seconds before the planes themselves became visible. Farmers would throw themselves into ditches. Seasoned soldiers would freeze mid-stride, their eyes darting skyward. Some veterans even claimed they could feel the vibration in their bones before their ears registered the sound. To the American GIs, that same noise was the sweetest music in the world. When they were pinned down in a hedgerow with mortar rounds dropping around them, the sight of a flight of broad-winged jugs circling overhead was enough to make hardened men cheer. They didn't call them Thunderbolts or P-47s. They called them the Big Friends. And the Big Friends always delivered.
Act 13, Autumn 1944, The Long Reach. Just when the Germans thought they had the Jug figured out as a ground attack plane, it reminded them it was still a world-class fighter. With the beachhead secure and airfields proliferating across France, the Thunderbolt once again stretched its legs. The problem of limited range, which had plagued it in 1943, was solved with the ingenious use of disposable fuel tanks. Engineers fitted the P-47 with a variety of drop tanks, 2 108-gallon metal wing tanks, or a sleeker 75-gallon paper belly tank. Yes, paper. It was cheap, worked fine, and burned away on impact. With these attached, the Jug could fly over 1,000 miles. This meant it could now escort the B-17s and B-24s all the way to Berlin and back, something that was once the exclusive domain of the P-51 Mustang. And at altitude, the Thunderbolt's secret weapon, the turbo supercharger, gave it a decisive edge. While the Mustang's Merlin engine, with its simpler supercharger, began to wheeze above 30,000 feet, the Pratt & Whitney in the Jug, force-fed by its complex tail-mounted turbo, was just hitting its stride. At 35,000 feet, the Thunderbolt was still king. The Luftwaffe, desperately trying to regroup with a handful of new pilots and the revolutionary Me-262 jet, found there was no safe haven. When they climbed to attack the bombers, they ran into walls of Thunderbolts waiting patiently in the sun, their pilots enjoying the comfort of cockpit pressurization, a feature many Jugs had that was like a luxury car compared to other fighters. Major Hub Zemke, now a grizzled group commander, distilled the Jug's philosophy for a new batch of pilots. Remember this, they can't kill what they can't catch, and nobody but nobody dives faster than a Jug. He wasn't boasting. The P-47, in a full-power dive, could comfortably exceed 550 miles per hour. There are credible, if slightly terrifying, accounts of pilots pushing their Jugs past Mach 0.8 in dives, the controls freezing solid and the airframe shuddering violently as it approached the sound barrier. The Luftwaffe, in their lighter fighters, tried to follow them down and often tore their own wings off in the attempt. The joke among German pilots became grimly revised. If you see a Thunderbolt above you, don't worry. If you see one behind you, it's too late. But if you see one diving, try to catch it if you want to die.
Act 14.
Winter 1944. The Fire and the Snow. The Ardennes Forest, December 1944. Hitler's last desperate gamble. The skies were choked with a thick, impenetrable fog for days, grounding the mighty Allied air forces. The Wehrmacht advanced, its panzers punching through thin American lines, clawing back miles of snow-covered forest in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. For the besieged American troops in Bastogne and St. Vif, it was a desperate, cold nightmare. Then on December 23rd, the weather broke. The next morning, the skies cleared to a brilliant, cold blue, and the thunderbolts rose like avenging angels. They fell upon the German columns in the snowbound Ardennes with a fury born of pent-up frustration. They strafed tanks until their ammunition was gone, then flew back to base, rearmed, refueled, and did it again. They shattered vital bridges across the Arth and Amblève rivers, trapping German armor. They turned entire forests into smoldering, cratered wastelands, incinerating infantry hiding among the trees. The effect on German morale was catastrophic. A captured German officer from the 1st SS Panzer Division later told his interrogators, "We stopped fearing your artillery. We learned to dig in against it. We feared the Jabos. They hunted us like wolves. There was no hiding. Even when we couldn't see them through the clouds, we could hear them, and we knew they were coming. It broke men." The Luftwaffe's final suicidal throw of the dice came on New Year's Day 1945, Operation Bodenplatte. Nearly 900 German fighters launched a massive surprise attack on Allied airfields across Belgium and Holland. It was a tactical success, destroying hundreds of aircraft on the ground, but it was a catastrophic strategic failure. The story goes that at one devastated airfield in Belgium, a smug German pilot, being led away as a prisoner, taunted his American captors, gesturing at the burning wrecks of P-47s. Major George Brooking, the commander of the 365th Fighter Group, his face smudged with soot, simply pointed toward the horizon where C-47 transport planes were already disgorging supplies and personnel. "By tomorrow," he said coldly, "we'll have 40 new ones rolling off the line. How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" He was almost certainly right. Within 48 hours, brand new Thunderbolts, fresh from the factories, were lining the repaired runways. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, had lost 271 aircraft and over 200 pilots, men who were utterly irreplaceable. Bodenplatte was the death rattle of the German Air Force. The end was now a matter of time.
Act 15. The Pacific Monster, October 1943 to 1945. While the Jug was busy dismantling the Third Reich, it was also carving its name across the vast expanse of the Pacific theater. The war against Japan was a different kind of fight. Over immense featureless oceans, in brutal tropical humidity that rotted everything, against a tenacious and different kind of enemy. The 348th Fighter Group, flying from primitive airstrips in New Guinea, discovered that the Thunderbolt's attributes were perfectly suited for this new battlefield. Its incredible toughness shrugged off both enemy fire and the corrosive effects of salt air. Its long range, especially in later models, allowed it to cover the vast distances between islands. And its devastating firepower was perfect for chewing up Japanese shipping, airfields, and ground installations. Leading the charge was Colonel Neil Kirby, a quiet, steely-eyed Texan. Kirby was an aggressive, fearless pilot who believed in the Jug's superiority. On October 11, 1943, he put that belief to the ultimate test. He and 3 wingmen stumbled upon a formation of nearly 40 Japanese aircraft over Wewak. Instead of fleeing, Kirby attacked. In a whirlwind, minutes-long battle, he shot down 6 Japanese planes, a feat of astounding audacity and skill that earned him the Medal of Honor. The Thunderbolt had proven it could tangle with the nimble Japanese fighters and win, not by turning with them, but by using its superior speed and firepower to slash through their formations. The Japanese, used to the lightweight, highly maneuverable Zero, were horrified by the Thunderbolt. Their 20mm cannon shells would strike the P-47, and often the plane would just shudder and keep flying. Its 50 caliber bullets, meanwhile, had a much higher velocity and rate of fire than Japanese machine guns, and their impact was devastating to the lightly built Japanese aircraft. Saburo Sakai, Japan's legendary ace, later admitted in his memoirs, "We called them monsters. Our 20mm cannon did nothing unless we hit a vital spot. I hit one with dozens of rounds, and it kept flying as if nothing had happened. Their return fire was terrifying. It didn't hit you, it consumed you. A 1-second burst was enough to tear a Zero to pieces." The Pacific War demanded ever more range to support the island-hopping campaign and the upcoming invasion of Japan itself. Republic's engineers delivered the ultimate jug, the P-47N. It had new, longer-span wings that housed more fuel, a more powerful engine, and better maneuverability. The P-47N could fly an astounding 2,300 miles, enough to escort B-29 superfortresses from the Marianas on their firebombing raids over Tokyo. What had begun as a short-legged heavyweight brawler had evolved into a globe-striding colossus. Act 16, 1945, Jets and Giants. The final technological card the Luftwaffe had to play was the Messerschmitt Me-262 Swalbe, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was a quantum leap in technology, capable of 540 miles per hour, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the fastest P-47. Armed with 4 30mm cannons, it could shred a B-17 in a single pass. For a terrifying moment, it seemed the war in the air might be turned on its head. But the Thunderbolt pilots, ever adaptable, found a way. They couldn't catch the 26 in a straight line, but they could ambush it. The jets were incredibly vulnerable during takeoff and landing, when their engines were slow to spool up and they were low on speed and altitude. The tactic was to loiter near known Messerschmitt 262 airfields. When a jet was spotted lumbering down the runway or coming in for a landing, the jugs would pounce. Their diving speed gave them the initial advantage, and a quick, accurate burst was all it took. The 26, for all its speed, was not built to take a pounding like the jug. On November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group proved it was possible. Spotting an Me-262 taking off, he dove his jug from 28,000 feet, building up to over 500 miles per hour. He lined the jet up in his sights and opened fire at 400 yards. His 850 calibers found their mark, and the revolutionary jet fighter exploded in midair, a fireball of defeated technology. Major George Bostwick would shoot down 2 more Me-262s in March 1945. He wrote matter-of-factly in his combat report, "The jets are faster, yes, but they can't turn with us, and they certainly can't take a hit. One good burst from our guns and they fly apart like paper toys." The Thunderbolt, the plane born of piston-powered brute force, had outlasted and outfought the first dawn of the jet age. It was a testament to its incredible versatility and the skill of the men who flew it.